All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's podcast. I'm thrilled to have with us today Daniel Frith, a great contributor to the 3D community, and my colleague over at Kronos, working on the 3D Commerce Group as our chair. So, Dan, let me hand it to you to give the audience a quick intro to your own background.
Oh, thanks, Mike. Lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I've worked in 3D since about 92, I think. I was in films. I worked a bit on things like Babylon 5 and some CG things, and then simulation, flight simulation for the military quite a few years. And I worked in games, worked in quite a few different areas. I worked on some big PC games and console games, and then I went back into advertising for a while and VFX and CGI. And then I guess probably one of the big turning points for me as in this space was I joined IKEA in 2017. So I moved to Sweden for IKEA, and I ran the 3D department for them there for roughly about 4 years. And it was a really interesting time because we took 3D across a total business perspective rather than it just being about images. We did IKEA Place and we converted everything over to real time, and glTF and PBR were critical to all that, and we'll come to that. And then I went to work for an AI-based company for a couple of years, which was really interesting. We were looking at neural radiance field and Gaussian of how to convert images over to 3D models. And then now I'm a company called London Dynamics, as Chief Creative Officer, and I'm working with some of the old IKEA Place team. And we provide 3D solutions for e-commerce type companies, furniture and bicycles and gym equipment, the usual stuff. But it's a really interesting journey. We have our own tech. It's based on a lot of standardized technologies like model viewer. But we fundamentally work with glTF and PBR in everything we do, which is really cool. That's me.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Oh, and
Thanks,
then I
Dan.
guess the chair thing, right? Sorry.
Well,
Um,
yeah, that's part of what you do these days.
yeah, I forgot about that. Yes, I'm chair of the 3D Commerce Working Group in Kronos with you. Thanks, Bill. And I'm vice chair on the 3D Formats Working Group with Alexei Medvedev. So they're both slightly different groups. One focuses more on the tech side of things, and the 3D Commerce Group, which you and I chair, is more focused on the e-commerce needs and use cases, I guess. Would that be a good way of describing it?
Yeah, it is. And I love how we kind of, work together, collaboratively in the sense that the 3D commerce team is helping to gather the requirements and educate the community, bring folks in to the table. And then we get, a really deep technical bench on the 3D formats team that can go in and, implement all these great features. And we'll get to, some of those kind of past, present, and future initiatives both within, driven by 3D commerce needs, but also some of the output that Formats has put together that's really helping to, propel the format and just 3D and the web in general, right? If I were to put it in a nutshell, I'd say we're trying to enable, 3D on the web, just trying to make it more democratized, easier to create content that's consistent and,
Yeah.
looks the same across every experience, because we ultimately are trying to represent physical objects, right? Which is maybe different than other 3D disciplines that maybe have a little more creativity or stylization. We're really more about that, pixel perfect replica, digital twin element.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we got quite a lot of interesting parties involved in it, right? We used to have Wayfair there, we had Target there. So a lot of companies from that sector. And I think the interesting thing, at least for me, we could start having a dialogue about this, is more about everyone seems to have a different problem statement. So it's not just a case of, I've got a sofa, I want to make a digital version of it, because people go around it in different ways. And there's a
Mhm.
different need from different sectors. And that's something we've been doing a lot in 3D commerce, is exploring those other sectors like apparel, like automotive, like, the medical industry. We actually have some members who attend now and again from that industry. And it's quite interesting. I think there's a core of glTF and PBR, and that's great. And all the work's done in Kronos around standardization. But the way it's used seems to be different in each flow, which is very interesting. So part of what we try to do, right, is to listen to them, say, hey, let's dig into that. Is there a need for this? Then we build like research around it, and then we take it to the formats group, and then they go, yes, no, we could do this, we could do that, or they develop something to support it, and then they join our group, and it's really interesting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm gonna take it back to the past a little bit because we both had kind of a
Right.
similar time period where you were at IKEA, I was at Wayfair. We always, I had the conversation with my colleague Lauren a few weeks back, and
Yeah.
we were saying how, we always look to IKEA as like a leader in the space.
Okay.
And one of the things that you guys have done well is digitize basically all your product offerings, right? So it made it easier to create like a more, consistent user experience, which is important and challenge for a lot of brands that span a large section of like random stuff. Like at Wayfair, we had millions of things coming from all kinds of suppliers.
Yeah.
Most of them had no 3D, thought process
Mm,
anywhere in the design.
yeah.
So that was always a challenge. But again, taking it back to kind of those early days, the Kronos Group, I think a lot of us contributing at the beginning were in that kind of more, furniture space. And 3D, I think, got a good, grounding with
Yeah.
augmented reality and physically large things.
Mm,
So a lot of our problem, statements at the beginning were around, anchor points. Do we stick this on the floor or the
yeah.
ceiling?
Yeah.
How should the model be orientated? Make sure scale is always in the same, type of units.
Yeah.
And, maybe in retrospect, some like simple things, but important things to at least specify. And then as we've advanced, maybe you want to talk a little bit about the work that we've done with standardization of attachment points and the glasses. I thought was
Yeah,
a good
yeah,
example.
yeah, yeah, that's good. I mean, before I move on to that, just back to the IKEA thing, just to sort of give a sort of pretext to that as well. When I joined, one of the first jobs I had to do was like, this sounds terrible, I suppose, but like we had Northern Europe's largest photography studio, and we had two of them. They were enormous hanger type double hangers where they used to photograph the room sets in the kitchens and the dining rooms and everything. It's a very costly process, obviously, but also
Mhm.
it's a very skilled process as well, because you have photographers who've been around there for a long time, and you had creative directors and you had art directors and interior designers part of that process. And it was really hard to kind of replicate that in 3D because of the process around it, not because of the tech that existed to do it. Um, but it was also a really big like recyclability, recycle if that's the right word. There was a lot of like if you strip up a floor of wood, what do you do with it at that point? You could sell it on to people, of course, or do you incinerate it, or do you landfill it? And what do you do with it? And that's the other advantage about 3D. So not only was it kind of more effective, but it was more cost effective, but it was also better for the
Mhm.
planet. It
But also
was
like, yeah, more environmentally
yeah,
friendly, right, of a
right. So
practice. Yeah.
that was one of the big things we had to try and achieve. And I think the interesting thing about that journey was more the onboarding of it, because what we really were determined to do was train the photographers to be 3D artists, and then train the
Mhm.
3D
Yeah.
artists to be photographers, so that there wasn't any skill gap. Because what you didn't want to do is shut down a studio and go, right, now what do we do? Right, put a 3D artist in front of it. They don't have the same creative eye a photographer might have. But then
Right, and
also,
they know the brand and the messaging and, like, the
yeah,
history too, right? And so you wanna
precisely. Right?
translate those kind of, skills and, internal knowledge, like, into a new role, and yeah, I think you're right, it's kind of a shift in maybe the process initially, but the output and hopefully the joy that comes from it, I think translates pretty well, especially for,
Yeah,
maybe folks that are tuning in that are in that photography space. Try, doing some 3D renders because it's actually quite empowering, right? Like, I think
well,
from the
this
2
is
of our perspectives, we've been doing it our whole lives,
yeah,
so you get
yeah,
to take it for granted, but there is some
yeah.
magic, seeing those images, those pixels kind of trace down the screen.
Yeah, and I think it's almost bridging the capability, bridging the skill gap is really important. So we trained the interior designers into SketchUp. So they were using SketchUp to interior design scenes, and then move that over into 3D so they could be rendered. So we built a library of all the 3D models, and we integrated to SketchUp and Max, and so that it would always bring the files in. So it meant interior designers could actually interior design in 3D, which was a big learning curve for them. But when they got it, it was a big game changer. They loved it. They were able to actually be more creative than they were with physical products, because they go, actually, I want to try that cupboard. I want to try that floor. I want to try this. I want to try that, which they couldn't do with a physical space. So actually, it opened the creativity, which was fantastic. We also did a price analysis of if I build a scene from scratch in 3D versus building a photography studio set, it's about the
Mhm.
same cost, but suddenly the cost just goes really drops when you swapping out materials, changing the floor, changing the wood, changing the worktops, because that has to be
Yeah, all that
reconstructed.
reusability
Yeah,
becomes like the big,
huge.
payback on it.
Right.
And once you build out those 3D rooms, you have them in your library, right, forever. Unlike
That's
a
the thing.
set where then you have to tear down the set when you're done with the shoot
Yeah.
and maybe recycle some of the parts, but you still got to reassemble it if you're going to reuse them
Right.
somewhere
So
else
that's the
again.
thing. The reason Kronos was so important to IKEA was because we wanted to make sure that we had a consistent experience when people saw our 3D models in real time. Um,
Yeah.
Rendered images is one thing because you're trying to recreate real life as a photographer, but in 3D. But it was getting that quality and that resolution and that finesse in the 3D models, and glTF was the only way we were able to do it. So, and
And this
PBR
is in
was
the
very,
like GLTF like 2.0 days too. Just to remind the
yeah,
audience how far it's come, visually, there have been a lot of efforts on the, PBR next, PBR
yeah,
being physically based rendering, extensions that have been added to the format over time that have added a lot of nice effects.
yeah, right. So, I mean, we would request things like we needed things like sheen, or we needed things like iridescence, or we needed a way of doing transmission through glass. And so we would try and get these extensions developed, and as with other people like Wayfair, Target, etc. So it was a really good group to go to and try and get that done. Of course, you can have your own development team do it, but the difference is that when it's standardized, you know that any browser that anyone's viewing it on is going to see the same experience, and that's what meant everything to IKEA was that we wanted the yellow strand model to look exactly the same on a Safari browser, Firefox, a MacBook, a PC, and that's you can only do that through standardization, and that's why Kronos was such an important part of what we were doing. And to that, I think the 3D Commerce Group's really good because what we try to do in 3D Commerce Working Group is listen to those needs and those requirements and explore those business, those critical things that make your physical product look brilliant digitally, and evolve the standards based upon the work we do. And then those standards then go into things like model viewer on Google browser. They go into like all the different browsers and all the different platforms. So then you know that when you've built your bicycle or your gym equipment, it's going to look the same on mobile as it will on here, as it will on there.
Mhm.
So
And
that's
ideally the same when it shows up at your door too, right? Once you
right.
order it online, sight
Well,
unseen, that digital representation should be as authentic as possible.
yeah, precisely. So like we've been doing a lot of work at London Dynamics on things like bicycle configurators, and they're like thousands and thousands of components. Like you can even change the pedal out to multiple options and bolts and things. But GeoTIFF and PBR enables us to kind of really create that. When you get that bike delivered, it looks exactly like that. So something that you and I did in a group did last year was around changing tone mapping. So
Yeah,
that
that's a great one to highlight.
yeah, and that was a really big game changer for many companies. And London Dynamics is a big game changer for us because a lot of the gym equipment or the bicycles were dark, and you weren't getting that richness in the tone. So with the PBR neutral tone mapper that we launched, which then became standardized in all the browsers, which is the importance of that standardization, meant that suddenly clients were seeing their bikes really black and they were really rich. And we had things like iridescence on some of the paintwork, and that really came out through PBR neutral. And we didn't get it the same with we had Aces, which was a filmic tone map, right? So
Yeah.
that work was fantastic because it was a big game changer for us, and we got feedback from two of our big clients, two of our biggest clients at the time, and they were like, "Oh, what have you done to the models? They look amazing," because they were just so rich, and that
Yeah,
was just
everything really started to pop, and
yeah,
I'm gonna try to do an in-depth session, a technical session with Emmett, one of these podcasts where he can kinda, like, delve into some of the, inner workings of the tone mapper. But yeah, I think, you're right, like, that was a great outcome, not only for our internal group members, but just across the board for 3D, and I was impressed with how fast it got implemented by,
Right.
the major viewers, at least,
Yeah.
they're part of our working group, right? So they're kind of like in it with us.
Yeah.
So I felt like, the model viewer one, well, obviously Emmett was doing model viewer, so that was kind of the first one, but even the Babylon implementation came like pretty much at the same time.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then a lot of our internal viewers that we make for our customers were able to kind of take advantage of that
Yeah.
quickly.
Right. So it was. I mean, for us at London Dynamics, it's always on by default now. So PBR neutral is our default tone mapper for every project we work on, which is great.
Yeah, and I'd recommend that to anyone tuning in as well. If you guys
Yeah.
have your own viewer or your own settings that you use for customers, check out the tone mapper because yeah, it unlocks some colors that you probably might not have seen good results on previously or good contrast in certain areas.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big game changer. And then we've been focusing a lot of energy on the render fidelity question, right? So, how do you create consistency of quality across different platforms? So, this is a really big thing. It's a particular thing close to my heart because everything I go through on a daily basis at London Dynamics is that and I've brought this up in the group a few times. We're finding more and more companies are kind of wanting to go back to rendered image. And this is
Mm,
because they're not necessarily getting the end result they wanted out of glTF and PBR. And it's actually, in the end, nothing to do with glTF and PBR. It's how it's authored. And it's how the PBRs are set onto the models, etc. So I think it's quite an interesting time right now because I think 2016, 2017, early, the IKEA days, early, where everyone was getting into CGI and the big enterprises were going from physical to digital and getting into glTF and PBR. We were doing renders, we were doing real time, but I think there's a there's a push in the industry right now where people are trying to go back to the images because they weren't getting those final results they wanted. Um,
yeah.
and I think we're doing these hero asset uh, tests. We've got a couple of projects on the moment. We're trying to fill the Kronos sample asset repo with assets that are really up here, but are still efficient.
Exactly. Yeah, we got to show people what's possible. And
Yeah,
the nice thing about that initiative too is it's not just the model, it's also the process, right? So we're documenting
precisely.
these are kind of the steps or these are the gotchas that you may need to
Yeah,
consider if you're implementing one of these newer extensions or if you're, got a random model off the internet, which is kind of how we started for most of these. And it was, part of the journey was okay, well, if you're downloading this model, look out for this, look out for that, some of the metallic maps and one of them like weren't even the right values, right?
yeah,
So it's like, well, you go in as a 3D artist and you can kind of technically make improvements to an either existing model or if you're drawing from scratch, hopefully you learn those
yeah.
practices. But you never know what you run into when you're dealing with source data from various
Oh,
clients.
yes. That's yeah. I mean, that's actually a really good sort of segue to something else I was going to talk to you about as well as about two things: the content creation guidelines, the initiative that you're running, which is
Yeah,
fantastic. We did one before, which was great, and of course, it's out of date now, so we're trying to update it now. But again, that supports people using glTF and PBR and pushing it to its boundaries by giving some guidelines. Um, and
and I'd say like one thing we're trying to do a little different this time versus a couple years back is maybe separate some of the numbers from the practices, right? So I think like last time we kind of put everything out there, and a lot of times when people would interact with us about it, they'd say, "Oh yeah, we're using the content creation guidelines. It says it shouldn't be more than I don't know 5 megabytes or something, right?" There's some
yeah,
numbers that we came up with. Maybe it was 50,000 triangles, and those numbers can really be case dependent. If you're having a offline experience in a store and you're not transmitting data, why limit yourself to just a few megabytes when you can have, really high quality content? But if
right.
you're on a mobile phone in an ad context and you want to load immediately,
Yeah,
then yeah, the file size is going to matter. So what we've done or we're doing as part of this new refresh is separating out these are best practices. This is how you should lay out your UV maps. This is how you should author your materials. These are the maps that do this, this, and this.
yeah,
And then separately saying, well, in this context, here's a profile that might fit a good use case for this year, 2025 virtual try on or a
yeah,
hero configurator experience on the web. And each of those, parameters can be tweaked and adjusted over time. So we use a tool called the Asset Auditor. that was written a few years back, and that's another toolbox item that we try to put out there for folks. In addition to the glTF validator, we get material compression tools. Dan, do you want to talk about some of those tools that are out there? Because I can't even think of them all.
Well, you wrote some of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, there's a lot of tools out there. There's a lot of. I mean, if you take the Kronos ones, you've got the glTF validator. You've got the compressors as well, which is really good. I really would suggest trying those out. I mean, we're doing a lot of work at the moment on how do we, because something that we try to do is not follow the kind of 1 meg, 2 meg, 5 meg, way of working. So a lot of our scenes in LD are kind of 20 meg, 15 to 20, 18 meg, right? Because
Mhm.
then a lot of our clients want to be able to go in close and see things. I've also been
Yeah, they're
trying.
spending time in those experiences, right? If you're configuring a bicycle, it's not like you're, swiping an ad. And
No,
so getting the higher quality content definitely makes sense because people are committed to the time and the experience.
yeah, precisely. So there's giving them a fulfilling experience, but there's a tricky balance between doing a 20, 25 meg car and making it unusable, right? Where you have to wait 10 seconds for it to load. And obviously
Hmm.
that's unusable on a mobile because, when you take that file, it uncompresses and it becomes quite big on the GPU. So what we've been doing a lot of work on at the moment is using things like Draco or KTX and other compression tools, which is like the glTF compressor is really good at using. So you've got Mesh Opt in there and Draco, and just trying to find those algorithms and find those numbers where if I've got this type of product and I put it in there and I drag the sliders to there, how low can I get it without it changing how visually it looks? And you'd be
Hmm.
surprised how much you can do. Um, like we've
Yeah,
been
I've been
really,
using the WebP textures recently
yeah,
and finding it's like ridiculously small. It's like
yeah,
you can take a file and get like 10x the size. And, sometimes there's a little bit of loss, but it really depends on, what the product is. So to your point, I think it's, a manual review. You look at the asset, you get it as low as you can,
yeah,
and then you get a faster experience in the end for the user.
yeah, definitely. And I think one of the issues that we can face in Kronos and companies like who we both work for as well, like, is that kind of a lot of the DCC tools don't necessarily support these things natively, right? So you can't build a physical material in like Max, and throw a WebP file on it. So the good thing about Kronos is that we can talk to Autodesk and, hey, we really need some support here. Can
Mhm.
we get
Yeah.
WebP into this? Because then we can start really compressing the textures up over here, and that would be great. So it's a really interesting time right now because we're trying to go for that ultimate fidelity. We're trying to get closer and closer to that photorealism. We're pushing the boundaries of geometry and textures, but we're having to use compression tools to find that sweet spot where hey, here's my file, it's 5 or 6 meg, but actually before that it was 35 meg. And
Mhm.
you don't notice that, but of course the customer gets a quick load and then they see this beautiful asset where they've got this headlight with transmission behind it and they're glowing and they've got this clear coat extension on the bodywork, but that all comes at a processing cost and a memory cost. So it's finding that tricky balance of refining that process. So we try to, anyway, we try to always work within that, pushing it to its absolute limit all the time, rather than going, here's a 1 meg, 2 meg asset. And I
Yeah,
think
no, that makes sense.
then I think the problem has been historically with GeoTIFF and PPI is people have focused on, well, that's what real time looks like. But actually,
Yeah, I think,
real
like, we're
time,
trying to set those, expectations higher now,
right,
with a lot of the work, and, just kind of for the final segment of this, let's talk a little bit about the future, right? So we've got kind of past, present, and, what's coming up 2025, but maybe even beyond that, 2026, 27. What are the things that the trends that you're seeing, that you think are interesting that we're gonna be covering? And, hopefully there's a call for you to get involved, right? So if you're interested in any of these futuristic topics and wanna shape the direction of glTF, please join us.
yeah,
So
yeah,
get in touch with, either Dan or I to, learn more about how you can contribute. We also have a new membership model, right? That's a little more
Yeah,
affordable for companies to try to get more participation, especially from brands that may not have like a technical history, like a lot of the Kronos members in the past. We're
yeah,
trying to broaden that horizon.
yeah, definitely. I mean, you and I have both been trying to get more apparel based companies involved, right? And I think that's kind of to your future this year, probably even into next year, is that we've done a lot of work. Patrick from Snap did amazing work on skeletal facial anchoring. Um, and I think we still need to add to that. I think there's still a lot of anchoring and like physical. How do you get the apparel industry closer to this? Of course, you've
Yeah,
got
any of this like virtual try-on or customization has some unique challenges in, the anchor points that we discussed. But another area of consideration, let's say, is the what elements might be adjustable and dynamic.
yeah,
Like an example of a ring, right? The band
yeah,
is going to be custom to the user's finger size, but the
yeah,
stone wouldn't change, right? So you can't just scale the whole object, and all of a
yeah,
sudden you get a big hand, you get a giant ring in the demo.
yeah,
So things like that, like what gets adjusted where? Do you add links to
yeah.
the chain of the watch band, to be realistic? And I think over time, these high-end brands that are investing want to see their product looking
Yes,
amazing, kind of to your point previously. And we got to that visual consistency,
yes,
but there is still a
absolutely.
lot of yeah, challenges remaining.
I still think there. Yeah, agreed. There is. I think there's an interesting thing. At least we're coming up against. It's sort of against, but I think we're embracing is the power of geometry and how that's processed versus textures. And I think that's a two-way thing there. One is we found that putting a lot of geometry into things rather than putting a lot of textures into things makes things look better. You can put a shader on, you can even make fonts and graphics as a geometry and put just a white or a
Yeah,
black in there, and it looks nicer. You can zoom into it, but the way it's processing geometry is a lot better. But I think that could be two things. We could focus a lot this year on getting the texture compression and finding different ways of getting the textures up, so we can throw 4K textures on models and it process it just fine, rather than it being way too much for anything to handle.
yeah. It would be nice to see like SVG texture support as well as you're
Right?
describing this, right? So like certain, logos or vector graphics that would be wrapped onto 3D could potentially alleviate some of the challenges that
That would be
brands have
great.
with their, logos not looking
Yeah.
good because there's only so much texture space available.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, you and I have both been talking a lot in the group about displacement mapping, because one of the things you do in rendered images, of course, you can displace the fluff and the bounce off a fabric. How do we do that in real time? Well, we can't without millions and millions and millions of polygons. So
Mhm.
we've been doing some research, and I think that's going to be quite interesting this year to see how we go to a hybrid of something like displacement in runtime. Because I think if we can find that, the interesting thing here is that because a lot more companies are kind of go, oh, we're going to go back to rendered image because it does the displacement, for example. If we can resolve that situation, have a
Yeah,
displacement
people won't need to
PBR,
go back. Yeah.
right? And people have spent millions, as you know, like Wayfair, IKEA have spent millions in building a glTF PBR library. And we don't want to throw that work away. What you want to do is enhance that and grow upon that. So I think that could be something to look at this year. Um, you're doing the content creation guidelines, which is great. We're doing more hero assets. We're going to do more videos as well this year, which would be good to sort of promote what we're doing, but also explain some suggestions. There were some really good videos we did last year with interviews with different people from different companies. That was really good. Um, but I think the apparel sector for me is the one thing, and probably AI are the two that are going to be worth definitely keeping a close eye on, because I think
Mhm.
Tim, who's the marketing director, and I have been talking to people from different standards organizations like the 3D Retail Consortium, and there's quite a few different groups who are focusing all their energy on fashion, and they're not really looking at GeoTIFF and PBR. They don't really understand what it's capable of, but they also want simulation. They want fabrics to drone, like to your point earlier.
Yeah, yeah,
They want
another,
big size
technical
boards.
challenge. Well, we could probably get there, but there's,
Yeah,
material properties that we're not even representing currently in GLTF that
precisely.
will be important that we can
Yeah,
maybe introduce through extensions to start with.
I mean, you mentioned Patagonia earlier, and it was, they're a really amazing company. They're kind of trying to push the boundaries of what they can do in 3D with a really small team, which is incredible. But they also, stitching is a problem, right? How do you create that stitching on a cap or on a logo? Not all logos are stitched, but some are. And just doing it with a normal map doesn't cut it, because doing it with a normal
Yeah,
map, it
agreed.
looks great from the front, but as soon as you turn it from there, it's like, oh, it's flat. So these are the problem statements I think we will dig into this year.
Yeah, and we're excited to, hopefully get your participation. Again, if you're tuning in and this is a topic that interests you, we're a pretty open group. We're trying to grow our group and, address all the interesting, challenges. Gauge and splats is probably another one that
Yeah,
comes to mind that we'll
yeah,
probably be looking
yeah,
into. There's still maybe a little bit of time of R&D before it gets to a standardization.
yeah, yeah,
But we were seeing a lot of interesting novel use cases of visualizing, maybe thin features or things that traditionally were harder for us to achieve.
yeah. And whereas AI with 3D content generation, we've been looking at that for a little bit, and it seemed quite premature. So that'd be interesting. I think that's going to surface again this year and next year as well. You know,
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
lots for us to look
Well, let's wrap up. I want to thank you, Dan, for joining
Thanks,
us
mate.
today,
Thank
and
you.
thank you guys for watching. And please reach out if you're interested in joining us within Kronos.
Thank you.